large parts of Western Europe that were very much removed from the Roman Empire. And so they didn't have as much contact as maybe they did with other parts of the Roman Empire. So when the Roman Empire collapses, there's nothing there kind of bringing that section of Europe together under one group, one heading. So it descends into chaos, into fighting, into all of those things that characterize what we call the Dark Ages. And there is a reason why we call them the Dark Ages. Now, interestingly enough, there was a point where the Eastern Roman, old Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, tries to bring the West back into the fold. There was an effort made by one of those Byzantine emperors, a guy named Justinian. Now, Justinian is going to rule from 527 to 565, so for a good long while. 527 to 565.
Is this chapter 12?
Yes.
Okay.
And he decides, I'm going to bring the West back into the fold. I'm going to recreate, at least in Europe, that part of the old Roman Empire. Is this CE? Yes. Yes. 527 to 565. So he needs an army to do this. And the way he gets that army is through some subterfuge, which does not make him very popular at that point in time. So one of the things that he would do is to tell men, hey, if you sign up for this army, if you sign up for my army, I'm going to pay you really well, which is all well and good, except you would have them sign these contracts. Except these contracts, you read the fine print, and who reads the fine print on everything that they collect, right? It's like the user agreements. I don't think I've ever read a single one of those, because if I want to use their service, I really don't care. I just click yes. Probably shouldn't do that. Probably not the best thing to do, but who reads those, right? So it's kind of like that. So they didn't read the fine print. Or maybe they couldn't read it all, so it didn't matter, because they couldn't read what was in front of them, and Justinian said, well, here's what this is, and so they say, okay, well, my emperor said this, so I'm going to sign it. What they were doing is signing this contract that basically says, in signing this, because Justinian, out of his gracious heart, has given you this contract, the payment for this contract is pretty much everything you have. Thank you, and have a nice day, right? So there were things that Justinian did that made people angry, but he felt he had to do them to build up the army necessary, he believed, to go fight the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Angles and the Saxons and all of those Germanic groups that we're going to talk about, the Gauls, all of those Germanic groups that we're going to talk about in just a minute that resided in Western Europe. The other thing that he would do is to forge wills and leave everything to him. So, an interesting guy, this Justinian guy, right? Eventually, the people are going to revolt. They revolt and destroy the city, destroy Constantinople. But at some point, Justinian says, I've got to leave. You know, they're closing in on the emperor's palace. His wife, interestingly enough, a woman named Theodora, refuses to go. She says, no, you're the emperor, I'm the empress, we're going to stay here and defend our palace. And so they do. And they end up winning. And they are going to kill, in the process, about 30,000 individuals who had risen up against Justinian, and also kill his political enemies. And so he's able to stay in power. Unfortunately, for him at least, he is not going to conquer what used to be the Western Roman Empire or Western Europe. And the reason is because he gets sick. There's this plague, we don't quite know what it is, some illness that hits the Byzantine Empire, and it kills about half of their population. And he's actually going to fall ill. He doesn't die, but he never fully recovers. And he's never able to go and take this large army, lead this large army to Western Europe to bring it back into the fold, if you will. So it never happens. There was that brief little moment in history where it might have happened, but it never happens. And so East and West stay disconnected. And it's interesting because when they are disconnected, when they become disconnected, they're no longer part of that empire, that Roman Empire, the East has all the advantages. They're centrally located with tapping all of those trade routes. So they function very well. The West, not so much. And here are a few things that historians say characterize Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Violence. They're all fighting each other for control. The Roman Empire isn't there, it creates a power vacuum, they're all fighting each other for control. Illiteracy, disease, and superstition. Sounds like good times. Violence, illiteracy, disease, and superstition. So again, those Middle Ages, although it's kind of rough, we don't have exact start or end dates. We kind of say it's the 8th to 9th centuries to about 1450 when we see the beginning of the Renaissance. This is where we see roads in disrepair, all those wonderful Roman roads. Well, the Roman Empire is not there to make sure that they are maintained, so they all fall into disrepair. All kinds of issues with violence and mortality. The mortality rate for children was about 50%. All of those superstitions that start to take hold. So those are going to be the prevailing characteristics of Western Europe. Okay, so let's talk about those Germanic groups. So I mentioned those Germanic groups that we're going to see take over in different parts of Europe, and I have a couple of them up here for you. Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Franks. The Ostrogoths are going to begin to take places in modern-day Italy, to take over control of places in modern-day Italy, under the leadership of a guy named Theodoric, who ruled from 493 to 526 CE. Theodoric is pretty much going to keep the governing structure, if you will, of the Roman Empire. So his governing structure very much mirrors the governing structure of the Roman Empire. The one difference is that Romans and Ostrogoths are separated. So he says, no, we're going to separate these two groups, and we're going to be in control of the government, but not them. And so we're going to separate these two groups in society. That was the same for the Visigoths. Now the Visigoths are going to inhabit what is modern-day Spain, at least until we see the Islamic Empire begin to take over vast parts of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. So the Visigoths are going to be there in Spain, and they too are going to keep, for all intents and purposes, that Roman government ruling structure, but they will institute a separation as well, into kind of like a social caste system, where they say, okay, we're going to be on top, we're the upper part, we're the upper social hierarchy, and all of these Romans who are here, well, they're at the bottom. Then we have the Angles and the Saxons, or the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribes in England, because England was always so far removed. They were always so far removed from the Roman Empire anyway. They didn't keep that Roman governmental structure because they weren't really too involved in it all that much. I mean, they were so far away. It was the outer lying regions of the Roman Empire. They're going to do their own thing. And we'll talk a bit more about them a little later on next week. And then we have the Franks. And the Franks are an interesting group. So the guy who is responsible for bringing the Frankish groups or tribes together is a guy named Clovis. He establishes what we call the Merovingian dynasty. Whoops, I spell it right. Merovingian. There we go. The Merovingian dynasty. And the reason it's called the Merovingian dynasty is because Clovis says he is related to a very famous Frankish ruler, a guy named Merovech. He says, well, I'm related to Merovech, so we're going to call this the Merovingians. So it is. Clovis is going to rule from 482 to 511 CE. 482 to 511 CE. He was known for a couple of things. One of the big reasons he's able to bring the Franks together is because he says everybody has to convert to Catholic Christianity. And you say, was there any other kind of Christianity? Yes, there was. There were actually two different kinds of Christianity, at least when we look at the Frankish kingdoms, the Frankish groups. There were two kinds of Christianity that were prevailing at that point in time before Clovis comes in and says we're all going to be Catholic Christians. So there were the Catholic Christians, and then there was a group called the Arian Christians. Not Aryan as in like Aryan, like Aryan as in Aryan race. Not that. But Arian Christians, Arian. So the Arian Christians and the Catholic Christians. And there was one huge, big difference between the two. There are other differences, but one big, huge one. And the one big, huge difference between the two, Catholic Christians said that Jesus was a man, but he was the substance of God as well. Arian Christians said, nope, he's just a man. So they're not going to agree with or believe in the idea of Jesus' divinity. Catholic Christians will. So Clovis actually converts to Catholic Catholicism, or to Catholic Christianity, to Catholicism. And the reason, interestingly enough, he converts is because he marries a woman who is a Catholic. Her name is Clotilde. Clotilde. She's an interesting historical figure and really is a good example of how upper class women functioned, at least in the early Middle Ages. Not necessarily working class medieval women, but upper class medieval women. They didn't have a whole lot of power and authority, but they could have some role or some agency within their societies. She was very influential in terms of religion. So she not only gets her husband to convert to Catholic Christianity, but she also is going to be a patron for the building of Catholic monasteries and Catholic churches across the lands. She is going to sort of run the household. Clovis will say, well, I'm off fighting wars and bringing people together, so you go run the household, you're in charge of that, and so she's going to be in charge of that. That was not uncommon for upper-class women in medieval times. If their husbands were required to go off to military duty, they were the ones at home, and they were going to be the ones who kind of took care of things when their husbands were gone. And that lasted into the High Middle Ages as well, to a certain extent. It was also not uncommon for women, upper-class women, to serve as regents for young sons. So let's say the husband dies, and her oldest son is only like 5 or 6, she is going to be his regent until he reaches age. He comes of age. So it was not uncommon for that to happen as well. The other thing Clovis is known for is not only does he say you have to convert to Catholic Christianity, and by the way, that was a way of bringing his people together. Because there were these two groups, these two religious groups, they are inevitably going to come into conflict with one another. And that was a way to bring everybody together and to say we're not going to have these religious battles because we're only one religion, and that is Catholic Christianity. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is true throughout the Middle Ages, and even into the Renaissance period, at least until we get to Protestant Reformation, is that the Catholic Church and political leaders could help to reinforce each other's authority in that particular region. So the political leader, the king, could say to the Catholic Church, okay, well, I'm going to get my people to convert to Christianity, to Catholic Christianity, but in exchange for that, I need you to say that I'm here by the grace of God so nobody will question my rule, or fewer people will question my rule. So that kind of thing. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship for both of those groups, and that is going to function throughout the Middle Ages. The last thing that Clovis is known for, that's his brutality. When it comes to bringing those Frankish groups together, it wasn't all touchy-feely stuff. It was going to be brutal warfare. Keep in mind that one of the characteristics of the Middle Ages is going to be violence. One of the things that he was known for whenever he sacked a town or sacked a group, sacked a community, he would say to the men in that community, okay, I'm not going to necessarily kill you all, which might very well have happened, or could happen if they said no to him. But he said, what I'm going to do is to make you equal members of my army. Pledge your loyalty to me and go around and fight in my army. You're going to be an equal member, and you're going to be treated equally by me and by the rest of the group. And so they're like, okay, well, death or equality. So they choose equality, right? So that allowed him to build basically a super army that he could take and use to unite the rest of those Frankish groups. The other thing that he did, and this plays into his reputation for brutality, he didn't want anybody questioning his rules, so he had his other male relatives who might challenge him for authority killed. So he had them killed, not his sons, kept his sons alive, but he had cousins and brothers and those kinds of male relatives killed. I'm sorry. So, when Clovis dies, because that's inevitable, when he dies, the Frankish custom at the time was to separate the lands, separate your holdings amongst your surviving sons. So that's what he did. And when that happens, it breaks up the Frankish kingdom, basically. And these sons are going to end up fighting each other for a pretty long time until the next person comes along. Eventually, we get to something called primogeniture. And anybody know what primogeniture is? What's that? It's a fancy Latin phrase that means what?
It's like it's not like the same as predecessor. It's
Nope.
like
But it has to do with inheritance. Yeah.
yeah.
So it's Tori. I'm sorry, I didn't see.
So the first son
Yeah.
gets everything.
Yeah, the first son gets everything, and that was seen as pragmatic, especially when we're dealing with lands, because then you don't have to split the lands apart. Now, the problem with that is, what do you do with the other sons, right? And they move to America. Eventually, yes. But the problem is, what do you do with the other sons? And the fathers had, especially nobles, had to be really kind of careful about that, because the reason behind the pragmatic reason behind primogeniture is to keep the lands together. They're more valuable if they're kept together than they are if they're split apart. But also to try to prevent challenges to the eldest son. Like, the eldest son is going to be the next in line. Hopefully find something for the other brothers to do. They're not going to challenge this guy for his authority. And so one son might go into the clergy, so he might become involved in the Catholic Church, another might do something else. So there was always the challenge of finding something for the other sons to do. But eventually they kind of realized that, hey, maybe that might be the best way of doing it. That way we don't have all of these kingdoms that we've spent so much time building up split apart because we're dividing it amongst our sons. If that makes sense. All right, any questions up to that point? We're going to get into some Germanic society here, which is kind of interesting stuff. Germanic society. So when we talk about Germanic society, and this is true for a lot of those Germanic tribes that we just talked about, the importance was placed on the extended family. So it wasn't just the family unit, the mom, the dad, and the kids, but it was the extended family as well. Which makes sense because we're talking about a time that was fairly violent and life expectancy wasn't great. And so you kind of had to have that extended family support, that extended family network for things to work. This was a patriarchal family structure. So even though upper class women did have some ability to manage things in their society, that wasn't true for all women, and basically they had to do whatever their husbands told them to do, or whatever their fathers told them to do, whatever the case may be. So it was a patriarchal family structure. The life expectancy for women was not great at that point in time. It was between 30 and 40 years of age. And the biggest reason for that, malnutrition, had to play a role. But the other reason was childbirth. Childbirth at this point in time was extraordinarily dangerous. It stays dangerous for quite some time, one, because of lack of medical knowledge, and two, because we don't have antibiotics or things that would, make childbirth a little less dangerous today, but childbirth could be very, very dangerous for women. And so the life expectancy for women is always a little less than the average life expectancy for men. And this is true, of course, in the Middle Ages as well. Because these were so violent, this was so violent in time, and we don't necessarily have, we don't have juries. Juries come much, much later. We see juries pop up in England in the 13th century. So it comes much, much later. We do have courts, but they aren't necessarily going to function like courts today would function. It's going to be the guy in charge, the noble in charge, pretty much passing judgment down. So yeah, he's kind of like the judge, but we don't necessarily have a jury of one's peers looking over evidence and trying to figure out who's guilty and who's not guilty. That's not how courts are going to function at this point in time. The other big problem is that we have crimes that are considered crimes of the community, crimes of the kingdom. So things like murder, things that would affect the entire community. And then we have personal crimes. So these personal crimes could develop into what was called at the time blood feuds. And this was always a concern for those people in charge, because here's how the blood feud would work. So let's say John goes over and knocks Henry down because he thinks that Henry did something to him, knocks him down, and Henry hits his head, and Henry becomes incapacitated in some way. Henry's family would consider that a slight against the entire family, not just Henry himself. And so in retaliation, for revenge, Henry's family is going to go over, drag John out of his house, and incapacitate him in some way as revenge. John's family is going to say, well, that's a slight against our family, so they're going to go over to Henry's family and find somebody else and incapacitate them in some way. See where I'm going with this? It's called the blood feud. And it's a vicious cycle, and this was always a problem because it was this back and forth revenge cycle that was very difficult to kind of get these families to get out of. And so what they decided to do at some point was to institute what's called the Wehrgeld, which basically means man money. So it's money for men. So if that kind of thing happened, John comes over, incapacitates Henry in some way, instead of this vicious cycle beginning where Henry and John's families go back and forth for years, what can happen is that the noble steps in and says, okay, we're going to negotiate a Wehrgeld. So Henry is incapacitated, John's family is responsible for paying Henry's family the value of Henry. So they have to place some kind of value on Henry and say he was worth this much to the family, and so John's family is responsible for that. And once that Wehrgeld was paid, that was considered the end of the blood feud. Like, Henry's family couldn't go incapacitate somebody, and John's family, the Wehrgeld took care of that. And I think we talked about this before when we talked in previous time. If not, somebody kind of remind me, because I'll go into more detail. But the other thing that we see in these early courts is something called the ordeal. We talked about that? The ordeal? Yeah? Okay. Sticking your hand in a vat of hot oil to grab the stone at the bottom. No. Okay. All right. So you're like, whoa, what is that? Okay, so that was the ordeal. And because we didn't have forensics or anything like that, because, again, courts did not function the way that courts do today, where you evaluate evidence and that sort of thing, one of the things that they would do is to say, these were very religious communities, they would say, well, God is not going to let an innocent person suffer. So because God is not going to let an innocent person suffer, if they go through this ordeal where they hold on to a white-hot iron until it burns their hand, obviously pretty severely, we're going to bandage the hand, and after 3 days, there's always 3 days, something in the Holy Trinity, there's always 3 days, they're going to unbandage the hand. And if they look at the burn and the burn seems to be healing, that is God showing his grace on that person, and that person was innocent. But if it looks like it's festering, God is punishing that person, and that person was guilty. That's the ordeal. So instead of an evaluation of evidence, that is the evaluation. The evaluation is the ordeal. So it would be the white hot iron that you would hold on to. Excuse me. Tickle my throat. Sorry, hold on. Darn allergies, right? Oh, it's that time of year. Okay, sorry about that. Or it would be the vat of hot oil, and there would be a rock or a pebble at the bottom, and the person would have to plunge their hand into the hot oil and grab the rock and pull it out. And again, of course, there would be the burn, and you would bandage it. As long as it started to heal in 3 days, assuming you don't die of blood poisoning, then everything was okay. But hey, if you died of blood poisoning, you were innocent, so it was all good. So that was the ordeal. That was the ordeal. And this was going to be how justice was determined in a lot of those medieval courts, early medieval courts. Eventually, we see the development of those juries and courts that look more similar to courts that we have today. That doesn't come until way later. The other interesting thing that we start to see, the development of church structure, the Catholic Christian Church and church structure in Europe as well. And here's the basic structure. So we have the lesser priests at the bottom, the bishops above them, the archbishop above them, cardinals above them, and finally the pope. Now, interestingly enough, before we had the pope, which by the way, I have up here, it comes from Papa or Father, who's the Holy Father, Pope. They did have upper bishops from Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and I'm missing one. Hold on. Jerusalem. I'm missing Jerusalem. Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and Jerusalem. So they had upper bishops from all of those places. And the reason it was those places, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and Jerusalem, is because that is where the disciples go to bring more people into the church. But the reason the Pope is going to become the Pope in Rome is because Peter was the first apostle, and he is going to, the first bishop of Rome, I should say, and he is going to be given the keys of heaven, and so he becomes the most important bishop, if you will, and eventually that position develops into the Pope. Now, interestingly enough, the Pope has always been in Rome, except for one brief period of history. We call that the Great Schism. Oops, where is it? Oh, I'm not on the thing. Oh, I guess not. All right, the Great Schism, we'll talk about it. So the Great Schism. This happens beginning in 1305. So beginning in 1305, we see the Great Schism. And the Great Schism happens when the Pope in 1305, a guy named Clement V, decides it was a Francophile, he liked France, he liked the Franks. And so he's going to move the Holy See, as it's called, from Rome to Avignon. So he makes that move. And then he makes sure that the cardinalships that he creates are all men from France. And so those successive popes are going to keep the Holy See at Avignon. Well, all things come to a head in 1378. In 1378, there is this Great Schism, where a couple of countries are going to support continuing to have the Holy See at Avignon, and a couple of countries are going to say, no, we want that Holy See back in Rome. And the two sides we see include the Scots, the French, and the Spanish. So the Scots, the French, and the Spanish want the Holy See in Avignon. And they support a pope called Clement VII. So the Scots, the French, and the Spanish support Pope Clement VII in Avignon. The English, the Germans, and the Italians support moving the Holy See back to Rome, and they support a guy named Urban VI.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. So the Scots, the French, and the Spanish support Clement VII in Avignon. And the English, the Italians, and the Germans support Urban VI in Rome. So for a period of time, we have two popes. And they're both claiming legitimacy. Now the church realizes, ooh, this is a big deal. It's a problem. This is a split in the Catholic Church. So what they decide to do in 1415 is to have something called the Council of Constance. Council of Constance. And it's at the Council of Constance that they decide what we're going to do is to start over. We're going to move the Holy See to Rome, and we're going to say it's going to be in Rome from now on. So they move it back to Rome, and the Pope who becomes Pope out of the Council of Constance is a guy named Martin V. Martin V. So there's a brief period of time where we do see a split, if you will, but mostly the Pope is going to be based in Rome. Oh, there's my picture. I forgot I made it there. Mostly the Pope is going to be based in Rome, briefly in Avignon. Council of Constance.
You said Martin V?
Martin V. Most people are never going to see the Pope. Most people aren't really ever going to see the cardinals or the archbishops. The people the religious figures they come into daily contact with, the lesser priests and the monks. And it became the monks' responsibility to kind of reach out to communities. It was one of their responsibilities. It was one of their religious efforts to reach out to the surrounding communities and to help those surrounding communities and bring them into religion. But monasteries are going to function a couple of different ways. And interestingly enough, the guy who comes up with the rules, the standard rules for a monastery, is a guy named Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict. Monk actually comes to us from the Latin word monachus, which means live separately, live alone. Well, monks don't live alone, they live together, but they live separately from a community and, of course, a monastery. So they do live separately, but, like I said, one of the things that they're responsible for is reaching out to the community occasionally. The reason they live separately is because the idea was it provided them a greater opportunity to devote themselves to their studies, to their religious studies, and to God. So they live separately because of that. So what did Saint Benedict say were the rules that monks should live by? Well, the first one is that they should live a communal life. They should eat, they should work, they should pray together. They should eat, they should work, they should pray together. That was considered important. So living that communal life. The second thing that they were supposed to do, hard work as a necessity. St. Benedict felt like idleness was sinfulness. If you didn't have anything to do, if you were just sitting around waiting for something to happen, your mind could wander and you could think about things that you should not be thinking about or do things that you should not be doing. So, if you were working, you didn't have time to sin. You didn't have time to think about stuff that you weren't supposed to be thinking about. So idleness is sinful, hard work is necessary. The third thing, common prayer and chanting, occurring several times a day. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about the medieval period is that from this period we see what's called Gregorian chants. Anybody ever heard those? I should bring those up. I should have played that at the beginning. Gregorian chants. It's very soothing, very relaxing. Let me see if I can find very quickly. an example for you here. Gregorian chants. Any idea what they're chanting? Not exactly what they're chanting, but just kind of generally what they're chanting.
Hymns or prayers.
So prayers in Latin. Latin is the language of the Catholic Church. Is still. So they're chanting prayers. And they would go on for a long time. It's very soothing, right? It was kind of a form of religious meditation in a way, certainly religious prayer, but religious meditation in a way. And St. Benedict said this was important as well. He had monks, thinking about those prayers, those words, the importance of them in community with other monks, but also was a way to meditate in a religious way. So we'll stop that. I'm gonna put you to sleep if I play more. But it's really cool. It's really cool stuff. Anyway, so the other thing that they did, apart from common prayer, was to follow the rule by the abbot. So the guy in charge, so the guy who was in charge of that particular monastery, and they were supposed to be completely loyal to those abbots. So if the abbot asked them to do something, then like go out to your community and do this, they would follow his lead. They are going to be involved in society, set up hospitals for the sick and those kinds of things. The other interesting thing about monasteries, and this was true for nunneries as well. So a little later in the unit, we're going to talk about the development of some of those nunneries as the Catholic Church develops in the Middle Ages. But monasteries and nunneries were really the keepers of knowledge at this time. This is the Dark Ages. And even when we get out of the Dark Ages, we get to the High Middle Ages, it's still not a time where we see a whole lot of literacy. Most people don't know how to read, but monks and nuns did, because they are the keepers of the knowledge. And you can see in this particular photo, or this particular drawing, here's a monk who is copying a religious work. Paper was extraordinarily rare and expensive. People didn't necessarily have it available to them. Books were extraordinarily rare and expensive because we didn't have Gutenberg's printing press. That doesn't come until the mid part of the 15th century during the Renaissance. So because there was no good way of mass producing works, the only way you could produce books was to copy them by hand. That was extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive. And so the only people who had really huge libraries at this point in time, at least in Western Europe, tended to be these monks and the monasteries and the nuns and the nunneries. They were the keepers of the knowledge. Very famously, there was a monk named the Venerable Bede, who had a library of about 250 books, which is pretty extraordinary. So 250 hand-copied books. And by the way, if you messed up, you had to start all over again. So not only were they the keepers of the knowledge, but if they were engaged in that kind of work, that tedious hand copying of religious works, it was a kind of exercise in discipline as well, because they had to really kind of focus on what they were doing. They didn't want to mess up. Yes.
How many books did you say?
250. Yeah, so that's pretty extraordinary for that period of time.
Was it paper or vellum?
Paper was extremely rare. It's a lot of vellum. Although not, Well, because paper comes from China at this point. So they were the ones making paper. They had the ability to make paper, which is kind of interesting to think about because we just kind of take it for granted that we have it. But it is a process. And so most of it would have been some other kind of material. Anybody ever have to make paper? I remember when I was in, did you? It's kind of cool, right? So we made recycled paper, and so it took pieces of paper and water and kind of squished it together. It wasn't really great paper, right? But you can do it, but you gain this this appreciation for paper making because again, we have the ability to mass produce this stuff, but when you take machines and technology away, it is a difficult thing to do. Saint Benedict was not exactly liked by everybody, at least during his life, because he institutes these pretty strict rules for monasteries. There were people in the monasteries who were like, we don't like you. So there were actually some attempts on his life, and these were very famous, and these come to us from different religious tales and stories. But one attempt, they tried to poison his drink. And so he picks up his drink, and there's a poison in it, and if he had anything to drink, he would have died. But he drops the glass accidentally, and it breaks, and the liquid spills, and so he's saved. And another time, they poison his bread. I'm like, well, we're going to get around that. Clumsy enough to drop his drink, we're going to get around that. So they poison his bread, except when he takes a chunk of the bread off and pulls it to his mouth to eat, here comes a bird in the window, flies, grabs the bread, and flies off. And saves him again. And the reason we hear these stories is because, why? Why do you think?
They were made up.
Yeah, so that is, say it a little one.
It's a way to venerate him by making him seem like...
It was a miracle, right? So to become a saint, you have to have performed certain miracles, and that was a miracle, and God was obviously saying, we're going to save this guy, right? So Saint Benedict is, of course, eventually going to become a saint after his death, but he is the one who is responsible for all of these strict rules for the monasteries. Yeah. All right, so let's go back to some political changes that we see, especially with the Frankish kingdoms. And one of those, there's this effort by the Islamic Empire. We talked about that as we talked about the spread of the Islamic Empire in Unit 3. We talked about how the Islamic Empire is eventually going to make it into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain. And they try to make it into France. And there was this very famous battle called the Battle of Tours. The Battle of Tours, where the French pulled them off. The Franks pulled off the Islamic Empire. And the guy who is responsible for that is that guy, Charles Martel, whose nickname, by the way, is the Hammer. Kind of like that annoying lawyer guy on those commercials.
Ryan Oncar?
Yeah, no, he's not the Hammer. Who's the Hammer?
Jim Adler.
Jim Adler. Oh my gosh. Those commercials annoy me, but every time I see them, it reminds me of Charles Martel, who probably deserves that title. I don't know about Jim Adler, but Charles Martel, yes, because he was known as being, just like Clovis, a very strong warrior. And so Charles Martel, who, by the way, lived from 686 to 741, 686 to 741, ruled from 718 to 741. Can you write this? Sure. So 686 to 741, ruled from 718 to 741. Sorry about that.
And this is over the Franks.
This is over the Franks. Yeah. Charles Martel is actually the grandfather of Charlemagne, who we're about to talk about. Charlemagne. Okay, so Charles Martel. And one of the things that he did, he said, okay, if we're going to fight out the Islamic Empire, we need a professional army. Like, we need an army that's trained, and we need to pay them. But how do we do that? So the first thing he does is to convince men to leave their farms and go fight. He says, look, you're not going to have farms if we don't hold off the Islamic Empire and keep them out of France. Yes?
When was this battle?
732. Good question. Sorry about that.
What's this battle called?
Tours. The Battle of Tours in 732. Neglected to mention that date. There we go. So the Battle of Tours in 732. So he says, you're not going to have farms if we can't hold off the Islamic Empire. So you need to leave your farms just for a little bit and help us fight and defend the Frankish kingdom. So they do, but the other thing is he has to pay them. So one of the things he does is to petition the Catholic Church and say to the Catholic Church, hey, look, this is as much a religious war as it is an invasion, and you need to support us, Catholic Christians, by giving money to me so I can disperse it to the men who are going to fight to hold off the spread of the Islamic Empire and the Frankish kingdoms. And he nearly gets himself excommunicated. It's pretty strongly worded correspondence that he has with the Catholic Church, but finally the Catholic Church gives in and says, okay, fine. So they give money, he's able to pay his army, and they hold off the Islamic Empire, the Battle of Tours. So what happens is that the leader of that Islamic army is killed and forces retreat to Spain. And part of that has to do with some trickery on Charles Martel's part, because he knows that the Islamic army is big and massive and well-trained and well-equipped. And so one of the things that he does, he knows that obviously they're going to fight on a field. And so while that fighting has commenced, he sends a group of his men back to the Islamic camp. And they're going to plunder, take anything of value that they find. But the other thing that they're supposed to do, and this is kind of interesting. So he has them run into soldiers who are back at the camp, reinforcements who are back at the camp. And his men say, oh, hey, why are you still here? All of the other guys have left. Like, we defeated you like a while back, and they've all run off, and here you are. I mean, we could take you captive, or we could let you leave. I mean, it's up to you. So his men convince the Islamic troops that the battle is over, when really it's being fought right at that moment. And so they leave. And so when the reinforcements leave, there are no reinforcements to go help the Islamic forces to go fight Charles Martel's army. So he wins the battle that way. It's really kind of interesting. So he uses some trickery too. Not only a good warrior, but also a pretty smart guy. Pretty smart guy to come up with that plan. Now, it didn't necessarily have to work. I mean, there was the potential that it wouldn't work, but it does for him. And so that's the end of the battle. Sure. When he dies, eventually the man who is going to rise up to become the king of the Franks and really kind of bring the Frankish kingdom together and bring it into a different period of history is Charlemagne. And I do have a picture of him, so let me switch. So Charlemagne and the establishment of what's called the Carolingian dynasty. Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne is going to live between 742 and 814. 742 and 814. Now, put those dates up here. 742 to 814. He rules from 768 to 814. And at one point, he rules with his brother. So his brother is going to rule alongside him. But his brother ends up dying. And the big question in history is, did he die natural causes, or did he die because his brother had him killed? We don't know for sure, because that's a long time ago. And yeah, he died. Or was murdered. I don't know. But he's dead. And that allows for Charlemagne to rule on his own. Interestingly enough, one of the things that you might have heard about Charlemagne is that he was illiterate, and that was true. He could not read and write. In fact, when he was an adult, he decided, I'm going to learn. And so he didn't learn to read and write until he was an adult. And he considered that so important that one of the things he is known for is establishment of schools across his empire, and you can see the extent. So he's going to spread the Frankish Empire quite a bit, actually, during his reign. But he considered that very important, and so he's going to establish those schools. He felt like, well, I learned to read and write, so other people should have the opportunity to do that as well. Now, not every peasant out in the field, unfortunately, is going to have that opportunity, but that does open the ability up, or at least the potential up, for a larger chunk of the population, if you will. The other thing that Charlemagne does, he conquers the Saxons. He conquers the Saxons. And you'll notice up there, and it's kind of off the map a little bit, but here's Saxony. When he conquers the Saxons, they are not Christians, they're not Catholic Christians, they're not Christians in general. And he decides, well, I'm going to force conversion. So any territory that he goes into where you don't see Catholic Christianity, you're going to see forced conversion. You're going to see forced conversion. Yes.
Just a quick question. The Saxonies, so there's already established Anglo-Saxons in the UK as well.
Yeah, keep in mind these are Germanic tribes,
Mm-hmm.
so they are going to be at different places.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they are I was just wondering when the Anglo-Saxons first started invading the UK. Or it wasn't the UK back then, but the British Isles.
Right. So, how early were they there? Because they were there for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we go back and look at Roman Empire, they're going to run into those Germanic tribes. They're going to run into the Celts, they're going to run into the Picts and the Goths and the whatever else. I'd have to look up a specific date.
Oh.
I think they came up from Denmark at some point, like super early, because of the Goths, like kind of taking over everything in Central, like continental Europe. They went over to the Isles.
Right,
But
and
don't know
I
when.
can't remember that date. It was early.
Mm-hmm.
They'd been there for a while and had been established for quite some time before we get to the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
But let me look up that date. I'll get back to you. Alrighty. Saxony. Yes, forced conversions. In fact, very famously or infamously, when he conquers the Saxons, he has about 4,500 to 5,000 Saxons killed for refusing to convert, and they're going to say, no, we're not going to convert, we're going to practice our religion. So he has 5,000 of them killed. And basically, he gave them a choice. He said, you can either convert to Christianity or we will kill you. And that is certainly going to be the case. 5,000? Between 4,500 and 5,000. Yeah. The other thing that he does that's kind of interesting, so as he's going into these different kingdoms and bringing them into the Frankish fold, if you will, he says, okay, well, I have this really large kingdom, how do I rule it? That's always a problem. We talked about that. That's like a theme in world history. If I'm adding all of this territory, how do I rule it? Well, he decides that he's going to divide up his territory and put a count or a noble in charge, if you will, in each one of those territories. If you've ever wondered why we had the word county, because it makes no sense, like where does that come from? It comes from this. It comes from dividing up territory and having different counties where a count literally would be in charge of that particular territory. And in the Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne, there were 350 of those counties. So 350 of those counties. However, he said, well, I don't want those counts to challenge me for my authority. Like, I don't want them to take over. So what he also had were two what were called missi dominici. Dominici, there we go. Missi dominici, which were called, not messengers, hold on, envoys of the Lord. And not like Lord as in like God, but Lord as in like King, like Charlemagne. So envoys of the Lord. And these two people, their sole responsibility was to travel around every year and to go to each one of these 350 counties and make sure that that count is going to stay in line. And he's not challenging Charlemagne for his authority, or he's not doing something that is questionable. So that was the sole responsibility of those two guys, Nisi Dominici. And for his part, Charlemagne is going to make an effort to travel around as well, because he doesn't just trust the counts, he doesn't just trust the Nisi Dominici. He's going to make a show as well and say to his people, hey, here I am. It's not like I'm stuck over here and I'm not doing anything. I'm going to keep tabs on you as well. The other important part of Charlemagne's rule, he becomes the first what's called Holy Roman Emperor. And we look at the Holy Roman Empire, it's this creation that basically takes a lot of those Germanic states and brings it together, and they call it the Holy Roman Empire. It is not an empire. Keep that in mind. It's also not Holy or Roman. But that's what it's called, the Holy Roman Empire. And it functions interestingly throughout this period, and really throughout the Renaissance period as well, because it's going to exist for a really long time. But the Holy Roman Empire is this Catholic Church creation in part that is a really good example of that mutually beneficial relationship between political leaders and religious leaders. Because if you could become Holy Roman Empire at the same time that you were the Frankish king, Charlemagne, then you could not only say, I am a political leader, but I hold this important political / religious role as well. So there's some duality to that person's importance. And we see that. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor could at some time pose a problem for the Catholic Church, become too large and become too powerful, and challenge the Catholic Church. And we see points in history where that has happened as well. But the Holy Roman Empire is going to be a really good example of that dual religious and political role that some of these individuals like Charlemagne are going to have. So it's an interesting creation that we see. Not an empire, but there it is. When Charlemagne dies, we don't yet have primogeniture, and his kingdom is divided. You would have thought that by now they'd figure that out. Like, let's not divide our kingdom because it's going to cause problems, but they didn't. And they divide the kingdom. And what happens is that it causes the Frankish kingdom to devolve into infighting, so battles between those different parts, those different groups. And we see battles between different groups in other parts of Europe, which weakens Western Europe enough, allowing the Vikings an in to Western Europe. It's by the time we get to the 800s, the 900s, that we start to see those Viking invasions in Europe, and these are important. Obviously, the Vikings come from Scandinavia, so why did they come? Any guesses? Why are they coming to Europe?
Warm.
Because it's warm. Because Scandinavia is cold. Like, even today, Scandinavia is cold. One of my husband's favorite things to do, and I've never figured out why, is to check the weather around the world. Because, especially during the summer, Texas summers, because I'm like, you're just making yourself feel bad. It's obviously not as hot in other places, but whatever. So he checks the weather in places like Stockholm. And even when we're in our winter, the weather in Stockholm is like in the 50s. Or something ridiculous like that. So it's colder. What's another reason the Vikings might come over? Did you have any random?
Oh, I was gonna say plunder.
Plunder, yeah, because they think spoils of war, right? And this is especially true when they start to run into those monasteries, and they find all of these things in the monasteries, the religious ornaments, and the books, and all of those things that have value. They're like, oh yeah, we need to go find more of these things. So the monasteries especially are going to bring those Vikings inland, but other places too, the castles and other places too, but the monasteries in particular. Any other reason why the Vikings would want to come over? Yeah, JJ.
New homes.
New homes. There was an overpopulation in Scandinavia at that point in time. And because there was this population boom, they didn't have anywhere to live. They didn't have anywhere to stay. They didn't have any land. And so they thought, well, the heck with this. If we can't find a livelihood here, we're going to go over there and figure out if we can live over there. So for all of these reasons, the Vikings are going to make their way into Europe. And there are a lot of navigable rivers in Europe, even to the present day, certainly back then. So even today, you see riverboat cruises in Europe, right? So all these advertisements for riverboat cruises in Europe, which sound really interesting. I've actually never been on one. But there are all of these navigable rivers, and one of the brilliant things that the Vikings are going to do when they do invade is to use these boats. They're called longboats. And they'll carry about 50 men, but they're very long and very narrow. And so they're not these huge ships that can't make it down those navigable rivers. So using those longboats and using those rivers, they can get inland into Europe in ways that they couldn't otherwise. Certainly easier to do that than to march on land. And they're going to cause a lot of problems when they get into Europe. One historian said it very well. He said, anytime you're attacked by a guy whose last name was Skull Splitter, you have to be concerned. I love that quote. They had a reputation for brutality. They had a reputation for violence, for being very brutal warriors. And that is certainly going to help them in some way. There's another story that got passed down as sort of a cautionary tale. Like if the Vikings are coming from you, you should be very cautious, just let them have whatever they want. But it was the story that had this Viking boy getting in some kind of argument with another Viking boy, and one Viking boy hits the other one on the head and kills him. And the mom looks at it in passing and says, "I'll make a good Viking one day," and walks on. So yeah, they had a reputation for being pretty brutal. There was one guy in particular called Ivar the Boneless, because he was born and he had legs that were not developed properly, and so he could never walk. But he was called Ivar the Boneless, and he decides, I'm going to invade Britain. So they do, and he invades the Yorkish part of Britain, and actually has the Yorkish king killed. So you can see here, if you're looking at this map, how the Viking invasions are going to go. They're eventually going to go to Iceland. They're going to go through the northern parts of England and eventually make it to the south. Now, they are stopped at the south. We'll get there in just a minute. But they'll come through the north first. So they get to the Yorkish part of England, and they capture the Yorkish king. And to give you another example, because I'm not sure if you know how brutal the Vikings are. I'm not quite sure. To give you another example of how brutal the Vikings tended to be, the Yorkish king was killed using something called the Bloody Eagle. So what they would do is to split open his chest, expose his ribs, and pull his lungs through his ribs to form wings. So that was a kind of torture that the Vikings liked to use an awful lot. So the Vikings decide, well, we're going to go down here to the south and invade South England. So they do, but the king in the south part of England, the Anglo-Saxon king in the south part of England, was this guy named Alfred, King Alfred. And King Alfred had heard all of these rumors of the Vikings, and he's like, we're going to hold these guys up. It takes 25 years. They fought for 25 years to hold the Vikings off in the south of England. Finally, they hold them off so they can't invade the south of England, but it takes another 25 years to get them out of England altogether. So this was a pretty long battle with the Vikings. Now, when they did invade, they're going to invade, plunder. Some of them will go back home, but interestingly enough, some of them will stay. Some of them will stay, some of them will settle, some of them will kind of assimilate or absorb into European communities that were already in existence. And so you do see a Viking influence, interestingly enough, in some way in some of these European countries. Little historical aside. So, anybody ever done one of those Ancestry.com DNA tests? Or 23andMe, or they have a couple of different versions out there. So it's kind of interesting to get the analysis back and kind of see. Well, I knew one person who had done that, and they had done their genealogy, and they knew that some of their ancestors were from Europe, but part of the percentage, and there's always a plus or minus, so there's always going to be a margin of error, right? Because they can't pinpoint it exactly unless they're looking at like mitochondrial DNA, which is reasons. So they're always going to be a plus or minus either way. But one of the little percentages that they had was Scandinavian, and they're like, I've done my ancestry, I have no Scandinavian in me whatsoever. And I'm like, oh, what? Did your ancestors come from a part of Europe that was invaded by the Vikings? You probably might. So it's kind of interesting to apply history to real life. It's really interesting how that happens. And they were like, oh yeah, that's really cool. I don't know that you're going to find the records because, you know, the Viking invasions happened a pretty long time ago. That could potentially be a reason why. And the percentage was quite low, but it could be a reason why. So it's kind of interesting. It's a little historical aside. All right. Any questions? Isn't there a show about the Vikings?
Yes.
I've never seen
Yeah,
it.
it's
I've always
awesome.
seen
Pretty good,
commercials.
actually.
Is it? Okay.
It's very good.
Very good.
All right.
Pretty accurate.
I'll check it out. Okay, so the kind of stuff very quickly, and then I think this will bring us up to the end, but very quickly, the kind of social structure that we see in Europe at this point in time, we call it feudalism, and it's going to last throughout the Middle Ages. And here's the basic structure. You have the king and queen. Nobles under them, so like the knights and the dukes and the lords and those kinds of things. Under them we have the vassals, so these are the knights, the heavily armed cavalry, no, it's not called horsed, mounted cavalry that is dressed in the heavy armor and the chainmail and all that good stuff. So the vassals are underneath them. And then underneath them we have peasants, sometimes referred to as the serfs. Now, this process we call something, it's a big word, it's called sub-infeudation. And the reason it's called sub-infeudation is because the king doesn't just have one noble, right? He may have several. There are several counts, or several dukes, or several whatevers. Each one of those nobles has several vassals underneath them, and each one of those vassals can have several peasants underneath them. Or those vassals can have vassals themselves, who can then have peasants underneath them. So this is actually a fairly simple chart to show a much more complex social structure that existed in Europe at this point in time, sub-infeudation. And when you get down to the vassal level, you want to make sure that this level has enough land that at the very least they can pay for their armor, which was very expensive, and pay for their horse. So they're not necessarily going to be wealthy down here at this level. They're going to be wealthier as you go up top, and certainly by the time you get to the king and the queen. Now, as far as this level, the peasants or the serfs, that was about 60% of European society. 60% of European society was down here, 40% was somewhere up here. Of course, when you get to the king and queen, it's a very small percentage, right? So how did feudalism work? Because these were very violent times, because these were very difficult times, the way that feudalism worked is that the king promised the vassal protection, promised his noble protection. The noble promised the vassal protection. The vassal promised the peasant protection. So everybody was going to protect everybody else. And in exchange, The peasant promised to work the land. The vassal promised to engage in some kind of military service at a certain point in the year. And if they went off to war, then they promised to go off to war and fight for the land. The noble promised not only military service if necessary, but also promised to go and be the judge in some of those disputes that might happen within the community, to mete out justice, if you will. So there was a beneficial relation, well, I don't want to say beneficial, because it wasn't necessarily beneficial for everybody. There was a mutually responsible relationship between each one of these groups. One person promised the other person something, promised the other person something, and then back up the chain. Now, when we talk about 60% of the population, they had an interesting time. They were not going to have a lot of the advantages that some of the higher nobles and vassals are going to have, but I think we'll talk about that on Tuesday. What we'll do on Tuesday is to continue with the Middle Ages. I'm giving you all of the overreaching information that I think you need to know. What we're going to do on Tuesday of next week is to get into some nitty-gritty social history stuff, which I think is really fascinating, especially when we're talking about the Middle Ages. So we'll get there. If you have not yet turned in your papers, please do so before you leave. I'll see you all on Tuesday.